September 17, 1939. Poland's eastern border erupted in the pre-dawn darkness as Soviet tanks and troops poured across without warning, without declaration, without mercy. The world had been watching Nazi Germany devour Western Poland for 2 weeks, but this eastern invasion caught many by surprise. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that devil's bargain between Hitler and Stalin, was now in full brutal effect. Poland found itself crushed between two totalitarian nightmares, and the country that had fought so desperately was being torn apart from both directions. The military collapse came fast. Within weeks, organized Polish resistance crumbled. The government fled into exile. But what happened next, what the Soviets did to their prisoners, would remain hidden for half a century. This is about 22,000 men who vanished without a trace, and about how the most powerful leaders in the free world helped bury the truth of their fate. Picture yourself as one of these Polish officers. Maybe you commanded an artillery battalion, or led a cavalry unit in those desperate final battles, but your military rank was only part of who you were. In civilian life, you practiced medicine in Krakow, or taught law at the university in Warsaw, or designed bridges in LWW. Poland's officer corps wasn't just soldiers, it was a cross-section of the nation's best minds. Doctors and engineers served as reserve officers. Professors and judges wore uniforms when their country needed them. When the Red Army swept through eastern Poland, they captured roughly 250,000 Polish soldiers. Stalin and his secret police chief Lavrenti Beria had special plans for certain prisoners, and the selection process was deliberate and calculated. They separated the officers from enlisted men. Police officers got pulled aside. Border guards, prison officials, anyone with authority or education. About 10,000 officers found themselves singled out for what the NKVD called special handling. The Soviets transported them deep into Russian territory to 3 camps with names that would haunt Polish memory. Kozelsk held mostly army officers. Ostashkov filled with police and border guards. Starobelsk confined military officers and intelligentsia. These weren't regular POW facilities, they were NKVD installations run by the secret police. The prisoners lived in isolation from the outside world, though conditions weren't yet unbearable. They received minimal food rations and could write censored letters home. Some organized makeshift classes to teach languages or discuss philosophy. They clung to dignity and routine because that's what kept men human in captivity. What none of them knew was that bureaucrats in Moscow were already compiling lists with their names, lists that would determine everything, lists that marked some men for death while others would survive by pure chance. Winter turned to spring in 1940, and rumors started spreading through the camps like wildfire. Maybe they'd be released soon. Maybe the Soviets would let them join Polish forces forming in France or England. Hope kindled in men who'd spent months in limbo. The mood lifted as prisoners convinced themselves they might actually see their families again, might hold their children, might sleep in their own beds. Then April came, and the NKVD began processing prisoners in organized groups. Men were being transferred somewhere, and those selected for the first transports felt lucky. They believed they were going home. They told themselves the nightmare was ending. Guards handed out food for the journey and kept their demeanor almost pleasant. The deception was perfect. "We're going back to Poland," prisoners whispered to each other. "They're sending us to join the British Army. The war will end, and we'll be free." Jeff Chapsky survived Starobelsk and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened. Years later, he described the confusion and false hope. There was no way of figuring out what were the selection criteria for the groups of us sent away from the camp. Some men boarded the transports eagerly. Others felt vague dread they couldn't explain. But almost everyone went with hope, because hope was all they had. The transports rolled out week after week. Group after group disappeared from the camps. Men left behind wondered when their turn would come, whether they'd see Warsaw's streets again, whether their wives still waited for them. By May of 1940, the three special camps sat nearly empty. Approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners had been shipped away to unknown destinations. And then came nothing but silence. Letters from the camps stopped arriving at homes across Poland. The men simply ceased to exist in any official record. Wives wrote desperate letters to Soviet authorities begging for information about their husbands. Children asked when Daddy would come home from the war. The Polish government in exile, operating from London, demanded answers from Moscow. Where were the officers? What happened to the men from Kozelsk and Ostashkov and Starobelsk? In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Stalin suddenly needed allies. The Soviets signed an agreement with the Polish government in exile and released General Władysław Anders from prison so he could form a new Polish army on Soviet soil. Anders asked the question that mattered most the moment he had the chance. Where are our officers? Where are the 10,000 men from those three camps? Stalin's answer was a masterpiece of casual evasion. Maybe they escaped, he suggested with a shrug. Perhaps they fled to Manchuria. He claimed the Soviet Union had simply lost track of them in the chaos of war. Stalin, who ran one of history's most ruthlessly efficient police states, who documented everything his regime did, claimed he'd misplaced 22,000 men like they were lost library books. Anders didn't believe a word of it. The Polish government knew it was a lie. But in 1941, Hitler's armies were driving deep into Soviet territory, and the Western Allies needed Stalin's help to survive. Questions about missing Polish officers seemed like an inconvenient distraction when the entire war hung in the balance. The families kept waiting. Mothers and wives and children held on to hope because giving up hope meant accepting the unthinkable. They wrote more letters that went unanswered. They prayed. They imagined their men were alive somewhere, suffering but breathing. Those 22,000 men were never coming home. They were already dead, murdered and buried in mass graves in forests whose names would become synonymous with evil. Katyn, Mednoye, Piatykaty, Kharkiv. The earth held them in secret, and the men who killed them were about to get away with it for 50 years with help from the most respected leaders in the Western world. This is the story of the Katyn Forest Massacre, but it's more than that. It's about how truth got buried alongside those bodies, how lies became official history, and how it took decades for the earth to give up its secrets. The cover-up might be an even greater crime than the massacre itself. March 5, 1940. Inside the Kremlin's inner sanctum, Lavrenti Beria sat down to write a document so damning that the Soviet Union would hide it for 50 years. Beria ran the NKVD, the secret police apparatus that made Stalin's terror possible. And the proposal he drafted that day was cold and bureaucratic in its efficiency. He recommended executing 25,700 Polish prisoners of war, not for anything they'd done, but for who they were. Officers who could lead resistance movements, intellectuals who could inspire rebellion, police who understood how to maintain order, leaders who would never accept Soviet domination. Beria labeled them nationalists and counter-revolutionaries, hardened enemies of Soviet power who posed an unacceptable threat. His solution was simple and final: kill them all. Stalin read the proposal and signed his approval without hesitation. Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister, added his signature. Kliment Voroshilov, the defense commissar, signed next. Anastas Mikoyan completed the circle of death. 4 strokes of the pen sealed the fate of 22,000 men who had no idea their lives were being measured in bureaucratic memos. The question that haunts historians is why Stalin ordered this particular atrocity. The answer lies in understanding his paranoia and his brutal long-term thinking. Poland had defeated Soviet Russia in 1920, and Stalin never forgot that humiliation or forgave it. Poland represented everything the Soviets feared: a fiercely independent nation that valued freedom over ideology, a Catholic country that would resist communist atheism, a people who'd proven they could fight and win. But revenge was only part of the calculation. Stalin was planning for a future where the Soviet Union controlled Poland, and he understood that controlling territory meant nothing if you couldn't control the population. These officers would become the nucleus of organized resistance if they survived. They'd form underground armies, inspire uprisings, coordinate sabotage. Every one of them represented potential leadership for movements that would drain Soviet resources and challenge Soviet authority for decades. Stalin decided to decapitate Poland before the Polish people even realized they were losing their head. It was strategic butchery, dressed up as security policy. The execution order went out on March 5th, but the NKVD kept the prisoners completely in the dark about their fate. The secret police had perfected the art of deception, having killed hundreds of thousands during the Great Purge. They knew how to keep victims calm and compliant right up to the moment of death. The night of April 3, 1940, marked the beginning of the slaughter. The first transport left Kozul's camp carrying 390 men who believed they were being transferred to another facility or perhaps released. Guards maintained professional demeanor and showed no hint of what awaited. The brutality would come later, hidden away where no witnesses could see. The journeys took several hours by train or truck. Prisoners arrived at various locations across Soviet-controlled territory. Some went to the Katyn forest near Smolensk. Others ended up at NKVD prisons in Kharkiv, Kalinin, and scattered facilities across the region. When they arrived, guards led them one by one into small rooms that had been soundproofed for their grim purpose. Execution chambers, though the men walking into them had no idea what these rooms really were. The killing method was efficient to the point of being industrial. One shot to the back of the head at the base of the skull. German Walther pistols delivered instant death, and the irony of using German weapons to commit Soviet murder wasn't lost on anyone who learned about it later. Each execution took seconds. The body dropped. Guards dragged it aside. The next prisoner was brought in. The executioners came from the elite ranks of the NKVD, trained killers from Moscow's Lubyanka prison and local secret police headquarters who'd honed their craft during Stalin's purges. These weren't soldiers following battlefield orders. They were specialists in murder who'd killed so many people that 22,000 more was just another assignment. Dmitry Tokarev ran the NKVD in Kalinin, and decades later he described the mechanics of mass murder with chilling matter-of-factness. The shooting started in the evening and ended at dawn, he testified when the truth finally came out. The first transport carried 390 people, and the executioners had difficulty killing so many people in one night. Let that sink in for a moment. Professional killers, men whose job was execution, found the numbers overwhelming on the first night. They struggled to murder 390 human beings fast enough, but they adapted and became more efficient. They organized shifts with teams of executioners rotating through the night so the killing could continue without pause. Shot after shot after shot, hour after hour, while bodies accumulated faster than they could be moved. The victims were buried with everything still in their pockets, and this detail would later prove crucial to exposing the crime. Documents and letters from home, photographs of wives and children, identity papers and diaries, watches and coins and cigarette cases. Everything stayed with the corpses because the killers were working too fast to thoroughly search tens of thousands of bodies, and besides, who would ever find these graves? This was Soviet territory, deep in forests controlled by the secret police. The bodies would decompose, the evidence would rot away, and nobody would ever know what happened. Guards threw corpses into massive pits that measured 28 meters long and 16 meters wide in some locations. The dead were stacked 12 layers deep in places, packed tight to maximize the efficiency of each grave. Then came the dirt and the pine branches camouflaging the disturbed earth, and then nature was left to do its work. The killing continued through April and into May. Transport after transport arrived from the camps. Group after group died in those soundproofed rooms. The camps gradually emptied while the forest graves filled with the dead. By mid-May 1940, approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners had been shot in the back of the head and buried in mass graves scattered across Western Soviet territory. On October 26, 1940, Beria issued another order that revealed the Soviet mindset about what they'd done. He awarded medals and promotions to 125 NKVD operatives for the proper performance of special tasks. Generals and officers and low-ranking executioners all received Stalin's gratitude. Bonuses and recognition for a job well done. The Soviet state was proud of this massacre. But something happened to many of these executioners in the years that followed. Something the documents reveal in fragments. Many became severe alcoholics. Some died mysteriously within just a few years of the killings. Others committed suicide. Even trained killers who'd murdered for Stalin before couldn't escape what they'd done at Katyn. The ghosts of 22,000 men followed them. The NKVD imposed absolute secrecy around the massacre. Grave sites became classified locations. Execution lists were sealed in secret files. Camp records were altered to show prisoners had been transferred elsewhere, creating a false paper trail that led nowhere. The bureaucracy of deception functioned perfectly. When families inquired about missing husbands and fathers, Soviet officials offered practiced lies. Your husband was sent east to a camp we cannot name. Your father is unavailable for correspondence at this time. Your son's location is classified for security reasons. The machinery of deceit, ground on without mercy for the families left behind. And the deception worked flawlessly for 3 years. The bodies rotted in their forest graves, while Stalin maintained his alliance with Hitler until Germany betrayed him in June 1941. Then, Stalin became the ally of Britain and America, the great partner in the fight against fascism, the hero standing against Hitler's evil. The Western press praised Soviet resistance and Soviet sacrifice. Nobody mentioned the 22,000 Poles moldering beneath Soviet soil. The forests kept their secrets well, but nothing stays buried forever. In 1943, the graves would be discovered, and the discoverers would be the last people anyone wanted to believe. Another group of monsters would expose Soviet crimes, not from any sense of justice, but from cold propaganda calculation. And that's when the real conspiracy would begin, the cover-up that would protect Stalin's reputation and sacrifice Polish lives on the altar of Allied unity. Before we continue with how the truth was discovered, if you're finding this story as shocking as it is, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. This is the kind of hidden history they don't teach in schools. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video. Now, let's get into how the crime was exposed and why the people who found it were the last ones anyone wanted to believe. June 22, 1941. Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa with 3 million German troops crashing across the Soviet border. The cynical alliance that had carved up Poland was dead, replaced by total war between two totalitarian powers. By autumn, German forces had captured Smolensk and occupied the forests of western Russia, including a small area near the village of Kozy Gory, close to Katyn. Local Russians knew something terrible had happened in those woods. Back in 1940, they'd watched trucks arrive after dark and heard gunfire echoing through the trees. NKVD guards had warned villagers to stay away from certain forest areas, and everyone understood that asking questions about what happened there could get you killed. The forest held secrets that everyone nearby sensed but nobody dared discuss. Polish forced laborers working for the Germans in 1942 started hearing whispers from the local population. Stories about mass graves. Rumors about Polish officers buried somewhere in the forest. The laborers began searching on their own initiative, driven by desperate hope that they might find answers about missing fathers and brothers. April 1942 brought the first discovery. A corpse in a Polish army uniform, partially exposed by erosion and scavenging animals. the laborers built a small birch cross to mark the spot and reported what they'd found to German authorities. But here's the thing. The Germans weren't interested. Not yet. The year was still 1942. The Wehrmacht was still advancing on multiple fronts, and old graves in a Russian forest seemed irrelevant compared to winning the war. The information got noted and filed away. Everything changed by February 1943. The German Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad in a defeat so catastrophic it broke the myth of German invincibility. The tide of war was turning against Hitler, and suddenly Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, saw potential in those forgotten graves near Katyn. German secret field police began systematic excavations on February 18, 1943. They dug carefully and methodically, treating the site like an archaeological investigation rather than a rushed military operation. What they uncovered staggered even hardened soldiers who'd seen years of war. Mass graves containing thousands of bodies, all wearing Polish uniforms, all shot execution style in the back of the head. Goebbels recognized propaganda gold when he saw it. The Soviet Union, currently allied with Britain and America, had committed a massive atrocity against Polish prisoners. If the Germans could prove Soviet guilt beyond any doubt, they could drive a wedge between the Allied powers and show the world what monsters the Soviets really were. The truth could accomplish what military victories no longer could. Radio Berlin broadcast the announcement on April 13, 1943. German military forces in the Katyn forest near Smolensk have uncovered a ditch, 28 meters long and 16 meters wide, in which the bodies of 3,000 Polish officers were piled up in 12 layers. The announcement was detailed and specific and absolutely calculated for maximum political impact. Goebbels understood exactly what he had and ordered the most professional investigation possible, because he wanted evidence that nobody could dispute. The Germans assembled the International Katyn Commission and brought in 12 forensic experts from occupied and neutral countries: Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Denmark, Finland, France, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Romania, Switzerland, and Czechoslovakia all sent medical professionals, not soldiers or propagandists. Scientists and doctors who could examine evidence objectively, or at least as objectively as anyone could under German occupation. The commission spent weeks examining bodies and documenting evidence. Dr. Ferenc Ors, a Hungarian pathologist with expertise in forensic science, made the breakthrough that sealed the case. Ors had developed techniques for dating corpses based on decomposition rates of soft tissue and the condition of internal organs. He examined bodies from the Katyn graves with meticulous care, noting the state of decay, the preservation of brain matter, the condition of uniforms and leather goods. His conclusion was definitive and damning. These men had died in spring 1940, not 1941 or after, not after the German invasion. They'd been killed when the area was under complete Soviet control, before German troops ever set foot in the region. The Germans pushed their investigation further by bringing in Allied prisoners of war as witnesses. This was brilliant in a twisted propaganda sense, because if American and British officers confirmed Soviet guilt, the evidence would carry even more weight with Western audiences. May 1943 saw a group of American and British POWs transported from their camps to Katyn. Lieutenant Colonel John Van Vliet, Jr. of the U.S. Army was among them, along with Lieutenant Colonel Donald Stewart and British officers including South African Lieutenant Colonel Frank Stevenson. These men were shown the mass graves, watched bodies being exhumed, and examined personal effects pulled from victims' pockets. Stewart described what he witnessed with the precision of a trained military observer. Many corpses were dressed in coats in good condition, Polish coats. I was a prisoner of war myself, and my clothes were worn out. Each of us individually noticed this, and based on the examination of these uniforms, we came to the conclusion that these officers could not have been in captivity for a long time when they died. The boots told the same story. The shoes were not worn at all, very slight signs of wear. If these shoes had been worn longer, they would have borne signs of more wear than was actually the case. Think about what this meant. These men had been captured in September 1939, and if they'd lived in camps until 1941 as the Soviets claimed, their uniforms and boots would have been falling apart from wear. But they weren't. They were barely worn, proving these men had died shortly after capture. Van Vliet made identical observations. Documents pulled from pockets showed letters, diaries, newspapers, identity cards. Nothing was dated later than April 1940. Not a single scrap of paper from 1941 or after. The timeline was airtight, and the conclusion was inescapable. The Soviets had murdered these men. Van Vliet and Stewart, still prisoners themselves and technically under German control, somehow managed to send coded messages back to U.S. Army intelligence. Secret communications describing what they'd witnessed, making clear their professional judgment. The Soviets are responsible for Katyn. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and the forensic analysis was solid. Witness testimony from credible sources, a clear timeline, and documentation that couldn't be explained away. By any objective standard, the case was closed. The Soviet Union was guilty of mass murder on an industrial scale. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the news came from Nazi Germany. The evidence was being presented by the people running the Holocaust and murdering millions across Europe. The source was Joseph Goebbels, one of history's most notorious liars and propagandists. The truth was being told by monsters who were using it for their own evil purposes, and Britain and America were now allied with Stalin. They needed the Soviet Union desperately to win the war. The Red Army was grinding down the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and Soviet blood was being spilled by the millions to defeat Hitler. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens would die fighting the Nazis, and that sacrifice was making Allied victory possible. When the Germans announced the Katyn discovery, the world faced an impossible moral dilemma. The truth was coming from liars, and the people who most needed to hear it didn't want to believe it, because believing it meant confronting an ally they couldn't afford to lose. The Polish government in exile in London immediately demanded an investigation by the International Red Cross. They knew what had happened to their officers. They wanted the world to know. They wanted justice for the murdered men and answers for the grieving families. Stalin's response came swift and furious. He accused the Poles of collaborating with Nazi propaganda and playing into German hands. He severed diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile, cutting them off and isolating them. He demanded the Western Allies reject German claims and support the Soviet position without question. Churchill and Roosevelt faced a choice that would define their legacies in ways they probably didn't fully understand at the time. Truth or alliance, justice or victory. The murdered Polish officers or the living Soviet soldiers fighting the Nazis, moral principle or political necessity. They chose alliance. They chose to bury the truth alongside the bodies in those forest graves. And in making that choice, they became part of the cover-up that would last 50 years and betray everything they claimed to be fighting for. The great defenders of freedom and democracy decided that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, and 22,000 Polish lives were the price of that decision. April 1943. The world was watching as the Germans opened the graves and displayed the evidence. The forensic reports were piling up, and the witness testimony was mounting. In London and Washington, two of history's greatest defenders of democracy were about to make one of their most morally compromising decisions. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, names that became synonymous with standing against tyranny and rallying the free world against fascism. Leaders who spoke eloquently about freedom and justice and human dignity, whose speeches inspired millions to resist evil. And both of them knew the Soviets were guilty of Katyn. They knew it with certainty. Intelligence reports sat on their desks. Witness testimony filled their briefings. Forensic analysis confirmed what the evidence showed. Everything pointed to Soviet guilt, but they made a calculated decision to look the other way and help maintain the lie. Churchill met privately with General Władysław Sikorski on April 15, 1943. Sikorski led the Polish government in exile, and Edward Radziecki, the Polish ambassador, joined them to discuss the Katyn discovery. Churchill's words in that private meeting were frank and almost sympathetic. Alas, the German revelations are probably true. The Bolsheviks can be very cruel. Think about those words. The German revelations are probably true. Churchill believed it. Privately, behind closed doors with Polish allies who'd already lost so much, he acknowledged Soviet guilt without hedging or equivocation. 9 days later, on April 24, 1943, Churchill sent a very different message, and this one went directly to Stalin. The words were completely opposite from what he'd told the Poles in private. "We shall certainly oppose vigorously any investigation by the International Red Cross or any other body in any territory under German authority. Such investigation would be a fraud, and its conclusions reached by terrorism." Churchill was telling Stalin he'd actively block an independent investigation. He'd prevent the Red Cross from examining evidence that he privately believed proved Soviet guilt. He'd help maintain the Soviet lie because the alliance mattered more than truth. British classified documents from the period spell it out clearly. Soviet guilt was deemed a near certainty by British intelligence analysts. But the documents also state that the alliance with the Soviets was deemed more important than moral issues. More important than moral issues. More important than 22,000 murdered men. More important than justice or truth or the principles Britain claimed to be fighting for. Roosevelt was no better, and in some ways he was worse because he had less excuse. When Stalin threatened to break relations with Poland over the Katyn affair, Roosevelt wrote to the Soviet dictator with reassurance designed to smooth things over. I am inclined to think that Prime Minister Churchill will find a way of prevailing upon the Polish government in London in the future to act with more common sense. Common sense. That's what Roosevelt called it when he urged the Poles to shut up about the murder of their officers. The real common sense, Roosevelt was saying, was to stop disrupting the alliance and accept that some questions shouldn't be asked. But Roosevelt knew the truth. American intelligence knew. A telegram sent by U.S. military intelligence on May 28, 1943, reveals everything about the American position and the cynical calculation behind it. Someone had offered information about Katyn, and the response was brutally blunt. "If you mean Katyn affair, am interested only if report shows German complicity." Read that carefully and understand what it means. American intelligence would only accept information if it blamed the Germans. They weren't interested in truth or justice or what actually happened. They were interested in maintaining a narrative that supported the alliance with Stalin, and any evidence that contradicted that narrative was unwelcome. And then it gets worse. Remember Lieutenant Colonel John Van Vliet, the American POW who'd been taken to Katyn by the Germans and examined the evidence firsthand? Who'd sent coded messages confirming Soviet guilt? In 1945, after he was liberated, Van Vliet wrote a detailed professional report, a thorough military assessment of what he'd witnessed at Katyn, written with the precision and objectivity expected of an Army officer. He submitted it through proper channels to Army intelligence, and that report landed on the desk of General Clayton Bissell, the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. Bissell read the report that documented Soviet war crimes with American witness testimony. And then, Bissell destroyed it. He literally destroyed evidence because it was politically inconvenient. Years later, Bissell testified that it wasn't in U.S. national interest to reveal Soviet guilt, that it would harm the war effort and damage relations with an important ally. He destroyed evidence of mass murder because keeping Stalin happy mattered more than exposing Soviet crimes. Van Vliet was ordered to keep silent about what he'd seen. The Army made it clear through channels both official and unofficial. Do not talk about Katyn. Do not go public with what you know. This stays buried, and that's an order. George Howard Earl learned the same lesson in an even more dramatic way. Earl had been the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania before Roosevelt appointed him as a special emissary with access to intelligence. Earl saw the evidence about Katyn accumulating in reports and intercepts. He kept sending it to Roosevelt, convinced the president needed to know the full truth. Report after report landed on Roosevelt's desk. Evidence after evidence. Earl was absolutely convinced the Soviets were guilty, and he thought surely Roosevelt, once fully informed, would act on this information and demand answers. Roosevelt's response was to have Earl transferred, reassigned to American Samoa, literally the other side of the world, as far from Washington as you could get without leaving American territory. The move was almost Soviet in its bluntness. Earl had become inconvenient by insisting on truth, so he was disappeared from the political scene and sent somewhere he couldn't cause problems. Keep him quiet and keep him away until the war is over and the alliance with Stalin has served its purpose. In May 1943, British Ambassador Owen O'Malley wrote what might be the most damning document of the entire cover-up. He prepared a detailed report for the British government acknowledging that all evidence pointed to Soviet guilt. He described the massacre in detail and made clear that British officials knew the truth and were choosing to suppress it. And then O'Malley wrote these devastating words that captured exactly what his government was doing. We have been obliged to restrain the Poles from putting their case clearly before the public, to discourage any attempts by the public and the press to probe the ugly story to the bottom. We have in fact perforce used the good name of England, like the murderers used the conifers to cover up a massacre. Use the good name of England to cover up a massacre. O'Malley understood exactly what was happening, and his role in it, and the knowledge clearly tortured him. He was using Britain's credibility, Britain's reputation for honesty and justice built over centuries, to hide Soviet crimes and protect Soviet lies. Churchill read the report and found it so important that he sent a copy to Roosevelt with a note recommending the president read it personally. But Churchill added one instruction that revealed the true nature of the cover-up. Return it to me afterwards for safekeeping. We're not circulating this officially in any way. Keep it secret. Keep it between us. Let's acknowledge the truth privately while we lie publicly, and make sure there's no paper trail showing what we really know. No record exists of Roosevelt's response to the O'Malley report. No memo, no letter, no comment preserved in the archives. Just silence. The President of the United States received detailed evidence of Soviet mass murder backed by witness testimony and forensic analysis, and the historical record shows he said nothing at all. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sat down together to plan the post-war world and decide the fate of millions. They discussed borders and occupation zones, spheres of influence and political arrangements. And Katyn was never mentioned. Not once. The three men who controlled the fate of Europe never discussed the murder of 22,000 Polish officers, never raised the issue, never demanded accountability. Poland's fate was decided at Yalta. The country would fall under Soviet influence, exactly what those murdered officers would have resisted if they'd lived. The very outcome Stalin had killed them to achieve was handed to him by Churchill and Roosevelt without a word of protest about the forest graves. The moral calculation was clear, and the logic was brutal. Defeating Hitler required Stalin and the Red Army. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of fighting on the Eastern Front, with casualties measured in the millions. Soviet armies were pushing toward Berlin and making Allied victory possible. The Western Allies needed Stalin more than they needed truth, and 22,000 dead Poles were acceptable collateral damage in the larger war. But the cost of that calculation was profound in ways that extended far beyond Katyn. It meant betraying Poland, the country Britain had gone to war to defend in September 1939. It meant becoming complicit in covering up mass murder. It meant compromising the very principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for, and it set a precedent that would haunt the post-war world. If the Soviets could get away with Katyn, what else could they get away with? If the Western Allies would suppress evidence of Soviet crimes during the war, would they do it after the war ended? The answer, as Eastern Europe would soon discover, was yes. The Iron Curtain would fall across the continent. Millions would live under Soviet domination, and when they cried out for justice, for truth, for recognition of Soviet crimes, they'd find that the West's willingness to look away hadn't ended with victory over Hitler. The Poles knew what was happening. The families of the murdered men understood the betrayal. Polish soldiers fighting alongside the Allies in Italy and France and across Europe saw Churchill and Roosevelt sacrifice truth for political expedience. They watched their allies become Stalin's accomplices in burying evidence and silencing witnesses. But what could they do? They were a government in exile without a country, a people scattered across the world and dependent on British and American support for everything. They had no leverage and no power. Just grief and rage, and the bitter knowledge that their men had been murdered and abandoned twice, once by Soviet bullets and once by Western silence. The war ended, and the Nazis were defeated. Justice was served at Nuremberg, where Nazi leaders faced trial for their crimes, but not for Katyn. At Nuremberg, Soviet prosecutors actually tried to include Katyn in the charges against Germany. They presented their fabricated evidence claiming the Wehrmacht had committed the massacre, and they expected the tribunal to accept it. But the lie was too obvious even for a show trial with Soviet judges sitting on the panel. The evidence didn't support the Soviet version, and even Allied prosecutors who wanted to maintain good relations with Stalin couldn't stomach putting this obvious falsehood into the official record. The Katyn charge was quietly dropped from the Nuremberg indictment. Not because justice was served, but because it was too embarrassing to maintain the fiction in open court. And so, the cover-up continued into the peace. The bodies remained in the ground where Soviet executioners had left them. The truth remained suppressed by both Soviet lies and Western complicity. And Churchill and Roosevelt, two men history remembers as heroes and saviors of democracy, went to their graves having helped Stalin hide one of the 20th century's worst atrocities. They chose victory over justice, and perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps defeating Hitler justified any compromise, but the price was paid by 22,000 dead Poles, whose murders were denied and whose families were left without answers or justice for 50 years. The war ended, and the Nazis were defeated. Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech warning about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. The Cold War began with all its paranoia and nuclear brinkmanship. And still, officially, the world accepted the Soviet lie about Katyn as if it were settled history. But in America, something was stirring in the Polish communities that had never stopped asking questions. They never forgot their murdered countrymen. They never stopped demanding justice for the officers whose families lived in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Buffalo, communities that had lost fathers and uncles and brothers to Stalin's bullets. Two men decided in 1949 that enough was enough. Arthur Bliss Lane, former U.S. ambassador to Poland, and Julius Epstein, an Austrian journalist and researcher who'd fled the Nazis and understood tyranny firsthand. Together they founded the American Committee for the Investigation of the Katyn Massacre with no government support and no official backing. Just donations from Polish-American communities and a determination to expose the truth that Washington wanted buried. For 2 years they gathered evidence and interviewed survivors, lobbied Congress and wrote articles, made Katyn impossible to ignore for politicians who represented districts with large Polish populations. They made enough noise that eventually someone in power had to respond. And then the Korean War changed everything. June 1950 brought Communist North Korea's invasion of South Korea. American troops were sent to fight, and suddenly Washington had a new concern that made Katyn relevant again. What would happen to American soldiers if they were captured by communist forces? Would they face the same fate as those Polish officers shot in the back of the head and buried in forest graves? Katyn wasn't ancient history anymore. It was a potential blueprint for what communist forces might do to American POWs. If the Soviets could murder 22,000 prisoners and get away with it, what would stop North Korea or China from doing the same to captured Americans? Congress started paying attention, and on September 18, 1951, the United States House of Representatives voted on House Resolution 390. The vote was unanimous, 398 to 0. Not a single dissenting voice from either party. The resolution established the Select Committee to conduct an investigation and study of the facts, evidence, and circumstances of the Katyn Forest Massacre, known as the Madden Committee after its chairman, Representative Ray Madden of Indiana. This wasn't some symbolic gesture designed to appease voters and then quietly disappear. This was a full-scale congressional investigation with subpoena power and a clear mandate to determine who killed the Polish officers at Katyn and whether American officials had covered it up. The committee had 7 members split between 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. All of them came from districts in the Northeast and Midwest with large Polish-American populations: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Massachusetts. These weren't random appointments. These were congressmen who heard about Katyn every time they attended church dinners and community events in their districts. Ray Madden himself was a World War I veteran who understood military justice and political reality. A lawyer who knew this investigation would be controversial and might complicate American foreign policy. He knew it would anger the Soviets and create diplomatic headaches for the State Department. He did it anyway, because 22,000 murdered men and their families deserved answers. The committee's first session was held on October 11, 1951, and the timing was urgent because their first witness was about to deploy to Korea. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Stewart had only 2 weeks before he'd be on a plane to Tokyo and then to the war zone where he was needed. The Army granted permission for Stewart to testify, but barely and with obvious reluctance. The Secretary of Defense and the Army Secretary both had to sign off on it. Even in 1951, 6 years after the war ended, the military was nervous about Katyn testimony and what it might reveal. The consent was specifically limited to this committee and this testimony only. Stewart could speak to Congress, but then he was expected to keep quiet. For 2.5 hours, Stewart told everything. He described being taken to Katyn as a POW in May 1943, marched through the forest to the mass graves. The bodies in Polish uniforms at various stages of decay. The state of decomposition that made it impossible these men had died recently. The personal effects pulled from pockets that dated to spring 1940, and nothing later. He brought 7 photographs that the Germans had given him at Katyn as souvenirs. Stewart had kept them hidden through the rest of his captivity, through his liberation, through 4 years of silence when he wasn't allowed to speak about what he'd seen. Now, he handed them to Congress as physical evidence that couldn't be destroyed like Van Vliet's report had been. The committee had those photos recorded on radiotape, creating a permanent record that couldn't be made to disappear by some general who found the truth inconvenient. 2 months later, in January 1952, Van Vliet himself finally testified. The man whose detailed 1945 report had been destroyed by Army intelligence. The man who'd been ordered to keep silent for years. Now, finally, he could speak on the record with congressional protection. He told the committee everything he'd seen at Katyn and everything he'd concluded from examining the evidence. And he confirmed what Stewart had said, that the evidence pointed overwhelmingly to Soviet guilt and that any claim of German responsibility was absurd. The committee didn't stop with American witnesses. They held hearings in Chicago to interview more people who couldn't easily travel to Washington. They heard from Kazimierz Skorzycki, who'd been at Katyn with the Polish Red Cross in 1943 and seen the exhumations firsthand. They summoned General Clayton Bissell himself, the man who destroyed Van Vliet's report, and made him defend his actions under oath. Bissell claimed it was necessary for national security. The committee didn't buy it. And then they did something unprecedented in congressional history. They took the investigation overseas to where the witnesses were: London, Frankfurt, Berlin, Naples. The Madden Committee became the first congressional committee ever to hold hearings on foreign soil, and they did it because the truth mattered more than convenience. In London, they heard from Polish generals who'd fought alongside the Allies: Tadeusz Komorowski, who'd led the Warsaw Uprising against the Germans; Zygmunt Bohus Sitzko; Władysław Anders, the man who'd asked Stalin about the missing officers back in 1941 and gotten lies in response. These men testified about the missing prisoners and Stalin's evasions, about the certainty that the Soviets were responsible. In Frankfurt, the committee interviewed members of the 1943 International Medical Commission, the forensic experts who'd examined the bodies and conducted the scientific analysis that dated the deaths to 1940. Specialists who stood by their findings 8 years later. They heard from Zhev Chapsky, the survivor of Starobelsk, who'd searched desperately for his fellow officers when Anders was forming the Polish army in Soviet territory. Chapsky testified about Soviet refusal to account for the missing men, about the lies and evasions and impossible explanations. The committee sent formal requests to multiple governments asking for assistance and access to documents. The Soviet Union, Poland, both the communist government in Warsaw and the government in exile, West Germany. They asked for cooperation in uncovering the truth. The responses were predictable. The Soviets refused outright. The communist Polish government refused. But the Polish government in exile eagerly cooperated because they'd been waiting 12 years for someone to officially investigate. West Germany also cooperated, happy to have a democratic country investigating non-German crimes and establishing that not every wartime atrocity was committed by the Wehrmacht. From October 1951 to November 1952, the Madden Committee worked systematically through the evidence. They interviewed 81 witnesses and took over 100 depositions. They examined 183 exhibits, ranging from photographs to documents to physical evidence. They produced 7 volumes of hearings totaling 2,362 pages of testimony and evidence that laid out the case in exhaustive detail. In July 1952, they released an interim report. In December 1952, the final report was published with conclusions that were unanimous. All 7 committee members, Democrats and Republicans alike, agreed on what the evidence showed. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, had murdered the Polish officers. The killings occurred in spring 1940 when the area was under Soviet control. The Soviets were responsible beyond any reasonable doubt. There was not a shred of credible evidence supporting German guilt. The report stated it with absolute clarity. On the basis of voluminous testimony, including that of recognized medical expert witnesses and other data assembled by our staff, this committee concluded there does not exist a scintilla of proof or even any remote circumstantial evidence that the Germans committed this mass murder. But the committee didn't stop at assigning blame for the massacre itself. They also investigated the American cover-up, and their findings on that front were almost as damning as the massacre. The Madden Committee concluded that the Roosevelt administration had deliberately suppressed evidence of Soviet guilt, that American officials had destroyed reports, silenced witnesses, and actively worked to maintain the Soviet lie for political purposes. The report documented how Van Vliet's 1945 report was destroyed by Army intelligence, how George Howard Earl was shipped off to Samoa to keep him quiet, how military intelligence refused to accept evidence unless it blamed the Germans, how the Army had pressured witnesses to remain silent about what they knew. It was all there in official congressional findings that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The United States government had covered up Soviet war crimes to maintain the wartime alliance, sacrificing justice for 22,000 murdered Poles on the altar of political expedience. The committee made a recommendation that should have changed history. They called for the United States to bring charges against the Soviet Union before the International Court of Justice at The Hague. They wanted an international tribunal. They wanted justice and accountability for the perpetrators. But the recommendation was never acted upon. The Cold War was intensifying with the Korean War still raging and Senator Joseph McCarthy conducting his communist witch hunts. The political climate was complicated and dangerous. Pursuing Katyn at the International Court would have meant a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union at a time when the superpowers were already on the brink, and it would have meant officially admitting that the United States had covered up Soviet crimes during World War II. The political establishment in both parties decided it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. The Madden Committee had done its job by putting the truth in the official record. But there would be no justice, no trials, no accountability for the men who ordered and carried out the massacre. For the Polish-American community, it was a bittersweet victory. Finally, their government had acknowledged the truth after years of denial. Finally, Congress had investigated and confirmed what they'd known all along. Finally, the evidence was public and undeniable in the official record. But the men who ordered the massacre were still alive and unpunished. Stalin was still in power in Moscow. Beria was still running the secret police. The executioners who'd pulled the triggers had never faced justice, and now it was clear they never would. The Soviet Union rejected the Madden Committee findings entirely. Soviet propaganda called it anti-Soviet slander and capitalist lies. They accused the committee of being tools of warmongers trying to undermine peace. They continued to insist the Germans were guilty and that the evidence was fabricated. And officially, for nearly 40 more years, that remained the Soviet position. The lie continued despite the congressional investigation. The graves remained. The truth was acknowledged in Washington but denied in Moscow, and that split reality had to suffice as justice. The families of the victims lived with that bitter knowledge, knowing what happened and having it confirmed by the American government, but unable to get real justice or even visit the graves in Soviet territory, unable to properly mourn the men they'd lost. Katyn remained a wound that wouldn't heal, a crime without punishment, a truth without justice. But the story still wasn't over, because the Soviet Union wouldn't last forever. And when it finally began to crack under its own contradictions, the truth about Katyn would be one of the things that broke through the lies. For nearly 4 decades after the Madden Committee published its findings, nothing changed in the official Soviet position. The lie remained state policy. The approved history taught in schools across the Soviet bloc stated that Nazi Germany committed the Katyn Massacre in 1941 during the occupation. Anyone who said otherwise was spreading fascist propaganda and could face serious consequences. In Soviet-controlled Poland, schoolchildren learned that the Germans killed the officers. Memorials were erected with inscriptions blaming the Nazis for crimes the Soviets committed. A 1952 book called The Truth About Katyn ignored all survivor testimony and witness accounts, asserting that the Germans had staged the entire discovery as anti-Soviet propaganda manufactured by Goebbels. Speaking the real truth about Katyn could get you arrested, imprisoned, or worse, depending on how loudly you spoke and how much the authorities decided to care. The families of the victims lived in a special kind of nightmare. They knew what happened to their fathers and brothers and sons, but they couldn't speak about it openly. They couldn't mourn properly or visit the graves. They couldn't even acknowledge the truth in public without risking punishment. Katyn became Poland's open secret, the thing everyone knew, but no one could say out loud without consequences. But in the 1980s, something began to shift in the Soviet system. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and introduced glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. He talked about confronting the dark pages of Soviet history and facing the truth about Stalin's crimes. He spoke of transparency and honesty as if these were revolutionary concepts, which in the Soviet context they absolutely were. The Poles immediately seized the opportunity and pushed hard. In 1987, Gorbachev and Polish leader Wojciech Jaruzelski signed an agreement establishing a joint Soviet-Polish commission to investigate the blank spots in their shared history. Katyn topped the list of questions that needed answers. Polish academics and historians and families of victims applied pressure from every direction. They demanded access to archives that had been sealed for decades. They demanded honest investigation instead of propaganda. The pressure came from Poland itself, from the Polish diaspora in America and Western Europe, from human rights organizations, from Soviet citizens themselves who were hungry for truth about what Stalin had done. Gorbachev found himself caught between competing forces, hardliners in his own government who didn't want to admit Soviet crimes, reformers who saw glasnost as meaningless unless it included historical honesty. The international community, watching to see if Soviet reforms were real or just another propaganda show. On October 30th, 1989, something remarkable happened that signaled the walls were crumbling. Gorbachev allowed several hundred Poles to visit the Katyn Memorial, and this group was organized by the Families of Katyn Victims Association. Among them was Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former U.S. National Security Advisor whose father had been a Polish diplomat who knew some of the murdered officers. They held a mass for the dead. They laid banners supporting the Solidarity movement that was challenging communist rule across Poland. And someone did something bold that would have gotten them shot a few years earlier. They placed a sign on the memorial covering the word Nazis, so the inscription read, "In memory of Polish officers murdered by the NKVD." For the first time in nearly 50 years, the truth was publicly displayed at Katyn itself. And Soviet authorities didn't remove it, didn't arrest anyone, didn't send secret police to intimidate the witnesses. They let it stand. And that silence spoke volumes about how much had changed. On April 13, 1990, exactly 47 years after the Germans announced the discovery of the graves, the Soviet news agency TASS published a statement that made history. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was unmistakable. Archival materials that have recently come to light allow us to conclude that the direct responsibility for the evil deeds in Katyn Forest lies with Beria and his accomplices. The Soviet side expresses deep regret over the tragedy and assesses it as one of the worst Stalinist outrages. Notice what they said and what they didn't say. They blamed Beria and his accomplices as if they'd acted independently. They called it a Stalinist outrage without mentioning Stalin's direct role or signature on the execution order. They didn't say the Soviet Union murdered these men. They said Beria did it. It was a partial truth, an admission carefully limited to protect the system while acknowledging undeniable facts. Still, it was more than Poland had gotten in half a century. Soviet guilt was finally, officially acknowledged by Moscow itself. Gorbachev personally handed documents to Polish President Jaruzelski, documents that proved Soviet responsibility and revealed there were multiple killing sites beyond Katyn: Mednoye, Piatakotki, Kharkiv. The massacre had been even larger than most people realized. Polish radio announced the news to a nation that had waited generations. Thousands of Poles have waited for this information for 47 years. Families wept. Churches held memorial services. The dead finally had some measure of official recognition. But even as Gorbachev admitted Soviet guilt, something cynical was happening behind the scenes. The Kremlin immediately launched what became known as the Anti-Katyn campaign, a propaganda effort designed to muddy the waters and deflect blame. The narrative went like this: yes, we admit we killed the Polish officers, but Poland committed genocide against Soviet prisoners in the 1920s during the Polish-Soviet War. Soviet soldiers imprisoned in Polish camps died by the thousands from disease and malnutrition. The conditions were terrible, and the deaths were preventable. So Katyn became revenge in the Russian telling. The Polish officers executed at Katyn were supposedly the same men who'd brutalized Soviet POWs 20 years earlier. It was justice, not murder. It was retaliation, not genocide. Poland had it coming. This was a lie built on half-truths. Soviet POWs did die in Polish camps during the 1920 war, but they died primarily from typhus and Spanish flu epidemics that ravaged Eastern Europe. The camps had inadequate medical facilities and conditions were harsh, but there was no systematic extermination program, no execution orders, no mass graves with bullets in the back of the head. And the officers killed at Katyn weren't the same men who'd fought in 1920. Many were too young, having been children or teenagers during that earlier war. This was intergenerational revenge at best, and pure murder at worst. But the anti-Katyn narrative served its purpose. It created false equivalence and let Russians feel less guilty. If Poland had killed Soviet prisoners first, then maybe Katyn was understandable, maybe even justified. The lies didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to exist as an alternative narrative. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin took things further as president of newly independent Russia. He released more documents that were absolutely explosive. The original March 5, 1940 proposal from Beria, with Stalin's signature clearly visible. Molotov's signature, Voroshilov's, Mikoyan's. The proof was undeniable now that Stalin had personally ordered the massacre at the highest levels of Soviet government. Yeltsin also released a 1959 memo from Alexander Shelepin, head of the KGB, to Nikita Khrushchev. This memo confirmed that Soviet archives held documents about the execution of 21,857 Polish citizens in 1940, and it recommended destroying all these documents to prevent future discovery. In 1959, Soviet leaders knew exactly what they'd done, had detailed records, and considered destroying the evidence entirely. Only their obsessive bureaucracy and compulsive documentation saved the proof. The Russian government opened an investigation through the Prosecutor General's office that lasted over a decade from 1990 to 2004. They confirmed Soviet responsibility and documented the crimes in detail with access to archives that had been sealed for 50 years. But here's what they wouldn't do. They refused to classify Katyn as a war crime. They refused to call it genocide. They refused to call it mass murder in the legal sense. Their reasoning was that the perpetrators were dead. Stalin died in 1953. Beria was executed the same year. The executioners were long gone. Without living perpetrators, they argued, there could be no trial. Without a trial, there was no need to officially classify the crime. It was a legal technicality that prevented formal justice and allowed Russia to acknowledge what happened without accepting full responsibility. The investigation closed in 2004. No charges filed against anyone. No one punished, not even posthumously. The dead got recognition, but not justice. In November 2010, the Russian Duma took another step by approving a declaration that officially condemned Stalin and other Soviet officials for ordering the massacre. It acknowledged Soviet responsibility clearly and expressed regret for what had been done. But Communist Party members in the Duma voted against it. They denied Soviet guilt even in 2010, claiming the evidence was fabricated and the documents Yeltsin released were forgeries. The propaganda never fully died. It just went underground and waited. And then things started going backward. Vladimir Putin came to power, and Russian nationalism resurged. Pride in Soviet history returned and became official policy again. Critical examination of the past became less welcome, then actively discouraged, then dangerous. In 2021, Russia's Ministry of Culture downgraded the Katyn Memorial from a site of federal importance to regional importance, a bureaucratic decision that signaled shifting priorities and diminishing recognition. And then, in April 2024, something shocking happened that showed how far Russia had regressed. Russian state media, specifically TASS, Published articles claiming that newly declassified documents proved Germany, not the Soviet Union, was responsible for Katyn. They were returning to the original Stalin-era lie 74 years after the massacre. The evidence they cited was absurd and easily debunked. Claims that German occupation currency was found in the graves, that the bullet wounds matched German execution methods rather than Soviet, that the bodies were too well preserved to have died in 1940. All of it contradicted by decades of forensic science and historical documentation that was already public. But the message was clear. Russia under Putin was rehabilitating Stalin and rewriting history, denying crimes that had been officially acknowledged. The brief window of glasnost had closed, and the old lies were being dusted off and presented as new revelations. And there's a direct connection to current events that makes this terrifying. When Russian forces committed atrocities in Bucha, Ukraine, in 2022, their propaganda used the exact same playbook. Deny responsibility, claim it was staged, accuse the victims of creating false evidence, say the West is spreading anti-Russian propaganda. It's the Katyn playbook, updated for the 21st century, with social media and modern communications. Lie boldly, deflect constantly, accuse the other side of what you're guilty of. Wait for people to forget or get confused. As of today, no one has been punished for Katyn. The Russian government has never issued a formal state apology despite acknowledging the crime. They've expressed regret, they've admitted it happened, but they haven't apologized. They haven't paid reparations. They haven't allowed full access to all archives. The final death toll stands at 21,857 confirmed victims, though the true number may never be known with certainty. Officers and police, border guards and teachers, doctors and lawyers and engineers, priests and professors, the intellectual elite of an entire generation, murdered in the forest and buried in unmarked graves. Their families waited 50 years for truth. Some waited their entire lives and died without seeing justice. The children who lost fathers in 1940 grew old and died themselves waiting for accountability that never came. But they're still fighting. Polish organizations continue to demand full disclosure of all Russian archives. They want every document, every execution list, every name accounted for. They want the world to remember what happened and why it matters. Because Katyn isn't just history. It's a warning about how easily truth can be buried when powerful nations decide lies serve their interests better. It shows how democracies will sacrifice justice for political convenience. How lies, if maintained long enough with enough official support, become almost impossible to dislodge from public consciousness. Churchill and Roosevelt helped bury the truth because they needed Stalin to defeat Hitler. They chose victory over justice, and you can argue that choice was necessary. That defeating Hitler was more important than exposing one Soviet atrocity. That sacrificing the truth about Katyn saved millions of lives by keeping the alliance intact. Maybe that's true. But the choice also set a precedent that echoes through history. It showed Stalin he could murder with impunity. It showed the world that the great democracies would look away from atrocities when politically convenient. And we're still living with those consequences. Russia still denies its crimes and rewrites history to suit current political needs, still uses the same techniques of propaganda and deflection that worked for 50 years with Katyn. The victims of that massacre deserved better. They deserved justice and accountability. They deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a historical footnote, but as individuals with names and families and futures that were stolen. 22,000 graves in the forest. 22,000 stories cut short by bullets to the back of the head. 22,000 families destroyed by a decision made in the Kremlin and protected by silence in London and Washington. And to this day, no one has truly been held accountable. That's the legacy of Katyn. Not just the massacre itself, but the cover-up that lasted half a century. The lies that became official history. The political calculation that some truths are too inconvenient to acknowledge. Remember their names and remember what happened. Because the moment we forget, the moment we let history be rewritten by people with political agendas, we make it possible for it to happen again. And it is happening again in different places with different victims, but the same pattern of violence followed by denial. Katyn should have taught us better, but we're still learning the same brutal lesson about truth and power, and we're learning it the hard way. That's the story of Katyn. 22,000 men murdered in cold blood. 50 years of lies maintained by one of history's most brutal regimes. A cover-up that reached the highest levels of Western power, implicating leaders we're taught to revere as heroes, and a truth that Russia is trying to bury again right now in 2024. If this video opened your eyes to history you never learned in school, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're bringing you the declassified secrets and uncomfortable truths that powerful people would rather stay buried. The stories that don't make it into textbooks because they're too complicated or too damning. Drop a comment below and tell me what shocked you most. Was it Churchill and Roosevelt's betrayal of Poland? The fact that no one was ever punished for murdering 22,000 people? Or that Russia is denying it again after admitting it for decades? Let's talk about it. Share this video with people who care about history and truth. These 22,000 victims deserve to be remembered. Their families fought for decades just to get the truth acknowledged. The least we can do is make sure their story doesn't disappear into the memory hole. Check the description for sources and further reading if you want to dive deeper. There are books, documentaries, and declassified documents available now that were hidden for half a century. The Madden Committee hearings alone are over 2,000 pages of testimony that lay out everything. And let me know what declassified World War II topic you want to see next. Until next time, stay curious and stay skeptical. Question what you're told. Dig into the sources. And remember that the official story is often just the story that powerful people found convenient.